Most of you know the name, and you might even know some of the story, but it's worth repeating again. If I bring up the name John Newton, does that name mean anything to you? Probably would mean a lot, and you don't have to do this, but if you picked up the hymn book that's right in front of you, and you were to take that hymn book and you were to turn to hymn number 343, you'd find a hymn in that hymn book. In fact, it's the most famous hymn in that hymn book because it's a little song called Amazing Grace. But if you're not familiar with John Newton, I want to tell you a little bit about him. John Newton was rough. He was a dirty sailor. He was a slave trader. He had a foul mouth. He had an appetite for rotten living. He hated life, and life hated him. But he had a couple of things on his side. Number one, he had a mama who was a Christian that not only prayed for him, but told him about the gospel as a child. And he had a friend, and a friend gave him a copy of a little book, Thomas Kempis's The Imitation of Christ. And he began on that slave ship to read the little copy of that book that he had. He was completely convinced of his foul and wretched condition, and he gave his life over to Christ, and he was radically and powerfully saved. Immediately upon being saved, John Newton went to preaching all over England, and he spent the rest of his life telling about the amazing grace of Jesus. Everywhere he went, he told about how God had rescued him, and he told about who he once was and how he once was lost, but now he was found. He was blind, but now he saw. He told people about the amazing grace and the glorious richness of the mercy of God, and he did it until he was old. He didn't retire at what we call retirement age. In fact, when he got too old to be able to do it by himself, they hired an assistant for John Newton, and he still would travel around and he would preach, but he was so weak that he had to have an assistant to help him because he couldn't get up the stairs to a pulpit. And he got to where he was so frail that he had to lean himself up against the pulpit to be able to speak. And he got so blind that to be able to read the Bible or his notes, he would have to lean over the Bible and get it just inches from his face. And then he began to lose his hearing, and with his hearing went his voice. And he was barely able to speak above a whisper. But he refused to quit declaring on the amazing grace of God. And the story is told that in one of his last sermons, that John Newton showed up, and his assistant helped him and walked him up the steps and propped him up against the pulpit, and that John Newton was leaning all of his weight on the pulpit, and with his eyes just barely above the pages of the Bible, he said in a whisper, just a whisper, this phrase. He said, Jesus Christ is precious. You could have heard a pin drop in the sanctuary because everyone that was there was leaning forward. They were just trying to hear what he said. And he took a moment, and then John Newton said these words again. Jesus Christ is precious. They said that his assistant that was standing to his side to make sure that he didn't fall reached over to John Newton, and he grabbed him by the back of the arm, and he whispered in his ear. He said, you've already said that twice. You see, the assistant thought that not only his eyesight, not only his voice, not only his physical stature, but maybe it was that he was losing his mind too. Maybe in his senility, he was just repeating it over and over again. But they said that something incredible happened that day, because when John Newton looked over at his assistant, they said that he took and he pushed his arms up against that pulpit, and he stood straight up and he held up his neck, and he looked around at that sanctuary, and all of a sudden a weak voice was replaced, and they said it sounded like thunder inside the sanctuary, and John Newton declared, Jesus Christ is precious. And everyone in there looked up, and he said, I said it before, and I'm going to say it again, and I'm going to say it again. Jesus Christ is precious. And they said there wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary because this old man, with every bit of strength that he had left, he declared the one thing that he knew to be true above everything else. And friends, when you can encounter a supreme God, a sufficient God, the Lord of all. I want you to know today that there are 1,000 ways that you could describe Jesus, that He is the omniscient, omnipresent, King of kings and Lord of lords. He is the great I am. He is Jehovah. He is the Rose of Sharon. He is the Prince of Peace. He is the everlasting Father. He is the Savior. He is the Redeemer. He is my friend. He is my hope. He is the anchor for my soul. He is my all in all. He is the fulfillment of prophecy. But friends, if I had to tell you, maybe just like John Newton did, if I had one way to describe my Jesus, maybe it would be to just simply tell you, Jesus Christ is precious.